When you look around at other industries, and whether it's actors or professional athletes, they all have an organization in which they are able to come together and discuss matters that are important to them. We've come together to create an organization for agents by agents in which we are able to have a collective voice.
When you have a really good idea at the right time, it's amazing. And that's what I think NYRAC is about. It's about perfect timing in the residential real estate industry.
What NYRAC presents an opportunity to do is to sort of elevate and evolve what we're doing. When you raise the bar for a group of people who already look to add value, it's a sort of a limitless possibility of what can come out of that.
It's a unique opportunity for all of us to engage with top professionals who have had years of experience in the industry, as well as those who are a bit newer.
Putting together an organization like this here is the perfect opportunity to elevate the standards that so many of us already uphold.
We want to create very curated, specialized events that will really entice the brokerage community to attend.
Getting a group of people who take what they do very, very seriously together and talk about best practices, tell how you handle this situation, how you handle that situation.
We'll have educational opportunities, incredible networking opportunities.
We have also created a social mission, which is very important to all of us to give back to the community.
There is a bunch of us that are very professional, that work very hard, that do read and learn and grow and really have the consumer's best interest at heart. And we would just want to take that and make it bigger. Just the conversations that we've been having starting this organization have changed my business, have changed the way I've been talking to my sellers.
I think there's a number of reasons why somebody would want to join. If we stand together and work together, I think we can actually accomplish a lot in improving the profession, improving the experience for the consumer, improving what's to come for younger brokers.
Good evening. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending tonight's event. No matter what coast you're on or what part of the world you're residing in, welcome to NYRAC Forward. We're thrilled to present tonight's Agent for Equity Roundtable with Richard Rothstein. First off, I'm honored to be on the board of such a forward-thinking organization that prides itself on being a progressive voice within the real estate brokerage community. In addition to educating our members on topics like these, the New York Real Estate Continuum is a strong agent advocate and also lobbies for policy changes that safeguards consumers and prohibits discrimination within the real estate industry. NYRAC wholeheartedly dedicates itself to equality for all. We help support agents of color and Black-owned businesses in New York City by engaging in conversations like these, which help all of us understand the history and importance behind the fair housing legislature we encounter in our everyday lives. As agents and industry leaders, we're committed to fueling greater buying power among African Americans and look forward to building equitable generational wealth in America. And tonight's presentation is a testament to just that. A little bit of housekeeping regarding tonight's technology. As we utilize YouTube for tonight's broadcast with Richard Rothstein, please take a note of the following ways you can engage with us in real time. If you're viewing on a mobile device, the chat box is beneath the video player. If you're viewing on a desktop or laptop, the chat box is on the right side of the screen. Do not be shy. We encourage you to comment, ask questions throughout the broadcast. We'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. And while many of you may not see everybody who's here with us tonight, there were so many moving parts in making tonight's event with Richard Rothstein possible. Thank you to NYRAC's event committee, first off, for bringing top quality content to our audience and ensuring all our events run super smoothly. Thank you to TitleVest, especially for hosting this event with Butterfly Voyage. It's a pleasure to continue our partnership with such excellent co-hosts. With all that being said, I'd like to take this moment to thank and introduce my co-moderator, the amazing Meghna Bondili, founder of Butterfly Voyage, a boutique consultancy that brings a fresh perspective to real estate development, design, and marketing. To Butterfly Voyage, Meghna brings 16 years of residential new development expertise in design, marketing, and branding for over $2 billion worth of real estate spanning from New York to San Francisco. We at NYRAC are forever grateful for her and her dedication towards putting tonight's presentation together. So without further ado, I'd like to have Meghna join us and introduce herself. Take it away, Meghna.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Terrence, and thank you, NYRAC, for inviting me to be a part of this very important conversation. Real estate, and particularly new development, plays a key role in advocating for positive change and is also a key pillar to enable generational wealth. I count many NYRAC members as friends. Some have even acted as informal mentors earlier in my career. And I was absolutely delighted to learn that NYRAC has introduced a formal mentorship program. Terrence, can you tell us more?
Of course. NYRAC is excited to be able to offer newer agents the opportunity to join the NYRAC Plus mentorship program. Members of NYRAC Plus are given the opportunity to collaborate with seasoned industry veterans. As an organization, we're committed to amplifying new agents in the residential real estate industry by fostering new talent, providing critical guidance, and supporting development of tomorrow's real estate leaders. Now, to speak to their experience with the NYRAC Plus mentorship program, here are Corcoran agents Dana Power and Evelyn Torres.
Hey, I'm Dana Power from Corcoran, and I'd like to introduce the NYRAC Mentorship Program. It's a 6-month partnership which pairs a NYRAC member and a NYRAC Plus member, and it's designed to give guidance, help with challenges, and provide insight on the industry. I was recently partnered with Evelyn Torres, and what I found is that the mentorship works both ways because you can always learn something new no matter how long you've been in the business. And here is Evelyn to give you a bit more of information about how you can get involved.
Hi everyone, my name is Evelyn Torres from the Corcoran Group. I am Dana's partner, and if you're interested in learning more about NYRAC's mentorship program, please email info@ny-rac.org, or you can reach out to any board member for more information. I think it is a great way to meet new people, and you just never know where it will lead you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you guys for that presentation. And also, anybody who's interested in getting involved with the amazing program or joining NYRAC as a member, please send an email directly to info@ny-rac.com. Once again, that's info@ny-rac.com, or visit our website for more information.
Wonderful. And now a big thank you to our generous sponsors. NYRAC's accomplishments would not be possible without their support. Every single one of them provides important services to our industry, and we encourage you to support them as they've supported us and continue to support us. Our gold sponsors include TitleVest for all of your title insurance needs, construction giant Skiami, the law firm of Romer DeVos, the property management firm XL Real Property, great name, the law firm of Shaves, Perlowitz, Luftig, LLP, and Roadway Moving, a nicer way to move.
Exactly. And now for our silver sponsors, we have the New York Real Estate Center, which is a new school led by Michael Romer and Pierre DeBoss, my guys, offering online and on-demand continuing education. The Daniel Frisch Architecture Studio, whose program provides streamlined economical improvements and yet still incorporates high design architecture into every home. Then we also have City Quiet Windows, the go-to place for providing a quiet space. City Quiet, they specialize in providing soundproof windows to address both the temporary and permanent noise conditions we all face in New York City. And with that being said, you can also pair your new soundproof windows with high quality window film by Layer. Layer is a window film that is cost effective to providing privacy or tinted glass, and it'll protect your home from any type of UV damage and glare. And last but not least, the company that has revolutionized the way we all as agents do our board packages, boardpackages.com. What would we do without them? NYRAC is proud to have the best in class sponsors that partner with us to make a difference in our industry. Without further ado, I'd like to take part of tonight's event and hand it over to Meghna Bondili. Meg, take it away.
Wonderful. Hi. Thank you, Terrence. I am honored and delighted to introduce Richard Rothstein, who is joining us tonight to discuss his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Richard is also a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In addition to The Color of Law, he is the author of many other articles and books on race and education. Welcome, Richard. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. So for our audience, our focus tonight is on the color of law and how laws and policy were and sometimes are conduits that help enable both racism and segregation. To echo Terrence, our goal for this discussion tonight is to first begin by informing you, then engage with you in our Q&A, which will be towards the latter part of the discussion, and inspire you to, most importantly, drive positive change for the future. So to begin with, I'd like to discuss, how did we arrive here? How are we at this moment in time? And Richard, my question to you is, what inspired you to write The Color of Law?
Well, that's an interesting question. You're asking me biography now, not the history, but I used to be, I don't know how many of you were in New York, but some of you may remember when I was the national education columnist at the New York Times. I was an education writer. That was my interest. And in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of them had a very, very trivial school desegregation plan. They permitted parents to choose which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to intensify the segregation of that school, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a parent who would not do so. So if we had an all-white or mostly white school, and both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, the black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. It was a trivial program. How often do you have one place left in the school and both a black and a white child apply for it? It's not a very frequent occurrence, but the Supreme Court evaluated this, denounced the program. The controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He said that, yes, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated, but he said the reason they're segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. He was right about that. In fact, school segregation today is more intense than it has been at any time in the last 45 years, and it's because of neighborhood segregation. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle were segregated de facto, is the term he used, without government involvement, because of the bigotry of private landlords or homeowners who wouldn't sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or the actions of private realtors or banks who discriminated in how they carried out their private sector activities, or because people like to live with each other of the same race. It's all a self-choice thing, or maybe it's just a result of income differences. And he said all of these de facto causes of segregation, government wasn't involved in it. And he said, if government wasn't involved, government is prohibited under the Constitution from fixing it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered reading about something that happened some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two school districts that was involved in this case. And in Louisville, there was a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb of Louisville. It was called Shively, was the name of the suburb. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. That African-American friend was renting an apartment, had a wife and a child. He was a decorated Navy veteran, had a good job, wanted to purchase a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this all-white suburb of Shively bought a second home, resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop this. They dynamited and firebombed the home despite the police presence, no effort to stop it. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having provoked a riot by selling a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I thought to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the prosecutors, the courts are all mobilized to enforce racial boundaries of Louisville, I looked into it a bit further, and I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of examples of cases, and I'm not exaggerating when I use these numbers, all across the country, in New York, in Boston, and Washington, and Baltimore, and Chicago, and Detroit. You go across the country, Los Angeles and San Francisco, of police-protected, often police mobilized and organized mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they legitimately purchased and rented in previously all-white neighborhoods. I said, this is not de facto segregation. Every one of these cases where the police were involved in protecting or organizing or leading mob violence was a violation of the 14th Amendment, a civil rights violation. And as American citizens, we have an obligation to remedy it, but we've never remedied any of these hundreds and hundreds of cases. So I began then to look into it further, and I found that it wasn't just police-protected mob violence that created the segregation today that we know today, but I discovered there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. I concluded that the whole notion of de facto segregation is a myth. It's nonsensical. We have an unconstitutional system of segregation in this country, and I documented it in the book, The Color of Law. And I haven't spent much time in the last 10 years writing about education anymore.
Okay. And in The Color of Law, you discuss both de facto segregation and de jure segregation. Can you tell us a bit about both, and also discuss why de jure segregation is the type of segregation we should be learning more about, and how it supported residential segregation within the United States?
Well, as I just said, de facto segregation is a term we all use, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, we all use the term. What it means is that the reason that neighborhoods are segregated in this country, either predominantly white or predominantly black in many cases, is just an accident. It's just happened in fact, de facto, not by law, not by regulation, not by public policy. That's a commonplace term. The lawyers use another term for the opposite of that, and that's de jure segregation. It's not so commonplace, but what it means is that segregation that was unconstitutionally created by government, by public policy, by ordinance, by law, by regulation. And if you have de jure segregation, that is unconstitutional segregation, which is indeed what we have in this country today, it's a civil rights violation. And all of us as Americans have an obligation under our Constitution to remedy it.
I agree. And, I think what's important for our audience to really understand is, why is real estate such an important element in the narrative of systemic racism?
Well, historically, the real estate industry was a contributor, an important contributor to the segregation that was created. I've emphasized in what I've said so far that this was a government project. It was unconstitutional, but it could not have carried it out without the cooperation of private institutions like real estate agencies. As you may know, up until the 1950s, the National Association of Realtors, I think it was called the National Association of Real Estate Boards at that time, but the National Association of Realtors had a code of ethics that prohibited realtors from selling homes in white neighborhoods to African Americans. You might say this is private activity, or private discrimination, but every one of the realtors, real estate agents who subscribed to that code of ethics was licensed by a state licensing agency that was committing a constitutional violation when it licensed a realtor who subscribed to that code of ethics. So this was an important contributor to the segregation that we have today. I recently wrote, I guess you're in New York, maybe some of you have seen it. About 2 months ago, I wrote an article, a cover story in the Sunday Review section of the New York Times, in which I used as an example a community in California, which was created as an all-white community in the 1940s, exclusively white, with government participation. But also in this article, I showed how activists today, civil rights activists, can identify the real estate agency that created that segregation in that community as an agent of the government, and can identify not only that agency, but the agency today that absorbed it. And I argued in this column, this article, that I published it, so I guess I can say the name, when Coldwell Banker purchased this small agency that had segregated this community, it absorbed not only the assets, the financial assets and liabilities of the small agency, but the moral liabilities as well. And I argued that Coldwell Banker has an obligation to participate in the redress of segregation that it so powerfully helped to create.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's important that you just mentioned are moral liabilities. I think we know legally today what is right and what is wrong when it comes to segregation. We know that blockbusting is illegal. We know that redlining is illegal. I learned something new from your book, which was reverse redlining. And the history of both, when you dive into it, are so brutal. How did they have such a profound impact on African Americans in the United States, their ability to build generational wealth?
Well, I think the explanation lies primarily in one of the main policies that the federal government pursued in order to create segregation. In the post-World War II period, millions of returning war veterans were coming home, needing housing. At the time, working class whites and blacks were all living in urban areas. We weren't a suburban country at the time. The only people who were living in the suburbs at that time were affluent families. Working class, middle class families were living in center cities. Most of them didn't have cars. The jobs were all located in the downtown factory district because factories needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts or ship their final products. We didn't have highways yet. The interstate highway system hadn't yet been designed. So you had these many integrated neighborhoods, actually, for that reason, in downtown areas. We'd be stunned if we were somehow transported back to that period to see the extent of integration that existed in these neighborhoods. But the federal government began a program to suburbanize the entire white working class population, middle class population, into single family homes in all white suburbs like the one I described earlier in Louisville. And you know these suburbs, they were all created in the post-war period. In New York, the biggest one is Levittown, east of New York City in Nassau County. You're familiar with that, but there are suburbs like that everywhere in the country. They created a white noose around downtown areas. Levittown was created as an all-white suburb by the federal government, as were these subdivisions elsewhere in the country. A builder like William Levitt could never have assembled the capital to buy the land and build that development on his own. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do it. 17,000 homes in one place. He had no buyers for it yet. We were in the suburban country. The banks thought this was a crazy idea. The only way that Levitt could get the capital to buy the land and build that development was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural design he was going to use, the construction materials, the layout of the streets, and a commitment that the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration required of him, that he never sell a home to an African American. These two federal agencies even required that he place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And if you look in these deeds today, or Levittown, or any of these other building projects that were built in the 1940s, post-World War II period, you'll still see that the deed says the home is for Caucasians only. You're all realtors. Maybe you look at the paperwork that comes through when you sell a home. If you look at the deed, you'll see it's for Caucasians only. You can't change it any more than you can wake up in the middle of the night and say, I want to change my property line. A deed is a deed. It's still there. It's unenforceable now. This requirement that the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration imposed was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written policy of the federal government. The Federal Housing Administration had a manual called the Underwriting Manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend for federal bank guarantees the application of builders to construct these post-war subdivisions. The manual said explicitly you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that was going to sell to African Americans. The manual even said you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a project that was for whites only if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial elements. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. A white noose was created around every metropolitan area with this racially explicit policy. Well, those homes in Levittown, to take that example, since we're in New York, that Levittown development, the homes were inexpensive. They sold for about $8,000 when they were first built in the late 1940s, 1950s. In today's inflation-adjusted dollars, that's about $100,000 for whites only. African-American returning war veterans or even any working-class African-Americans who had jobs in the post-war economy could have afforded a home for $100,000. If they were a returning war veteran, no down payment was required. So it wasn't they couldn't afford them. It's that they were prohibited from purchasing these homes. I actually, about Levittown, in The Color of Law, I describe an African-American family that owned a trucking business. The trucking business had a contract with Levitt to deliver construction materials to Levittown as it was being built. But when a Navy veteran who was part of that family and worked in the trucking business wanted to buy a home in Levittown, he was refused because they wouldn't sell to African Americans. Well, as I say, they sold at the time for $100,000, as you know, better than I do because you're in the business. You can't buy a home in Levittown for $100,000 today.
It's interesting. It's almost if we moved from an idea of integration and we encourage segregation, and how important not only access to capital, but allocation of that capital help to really drive these policies home and further segregate and racially discriminate against African Americans. So my question to you with the Levittown example, the value today versus the cost then, has de jure racism led to an American caste system? Have we moved many African Americans into a cycle of poverty? What were other ways that African Americans were not able to invest and build generational wealth?
Well, Meghna, let me focus on this one just again for a minute because it's the best example, best answer to your question. Those homes now sell, what do they sell for? $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in that community? Well, the white families who bought those homes gained wealth from the equity, from the appreciation and the value of those homes. They used it to send their children to college. They used it to maybe take care of emergencies, medical or unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And this goes directly to your question, they used that wealth to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans today have incomes, family incomes, that are about 60% on average of white incomes. And you'd think that there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But the reality is that while African American incomes, family incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is only 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio, which is multi-generational, is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. So if you ask how did those policies that maybe were carried out 70 years ago How do they impact today? Well, they impact today because of the intergenerational transmission of wealth. And most families in this country who have any wealth have it because of the equity they have in their homes. So by federal unconstitutional policy, denying African Americans the opportunity to accumulate wealth in the same way that white families did, we created, you called it a caste system. I don't think that's an inappropriate term.
Wow. So, I think what we've really learned from this is it's not only impacted, again, communities, cities, people, it's also impacted our industry. To share a personal story, I have friends that have bought houses in California. I'm in Northern California, and houses in Texas. And there has been a clause, and it's very brutal to hear these words, but you're not allowing the owner at the time to sell to a Negro. We don't use that word anymore, but it is very painful for people to see after decades that those things still exist. And, what I'd like to do now is invite Terrence back and discuss, have more of an active discussion about where we are today and how to move forward.
Perfect. Thank you, Meghna. And hello, Richard. Thank you so much for gracing us with your time. Your wealth of knowledge on this is mind-blowing. I couldn't even begin to remember at least 10% of all of this. So thank you again.
Well, I wouldn't know how to sell someone a home, so even.
All right. So my question is, if you can break it down, as Americans, why is it our responsibility to actively shape our future? And why are we responsible for the past, even if it wasn't everybody's personal doing? And get into why this accountability is so hard for a lot of people to come to terms with.
Well, that's a great question. And you may know, if you read my book, I recount a story. I was once on a panel with Cheryl and Eiffel, who is the director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And we were giving a presentation about this history. And after it ended, someone got up, and we had the question and answer period. And someone got up and said, my family only came to this country one generation ago. We weren't responsible for doing this. Why should we have to fix it? Why should we be responsible for fixing it? It's not our doing, it's someone else's. And Sherilyn, who is brilliant, I don't know if you've met her, but she's brilliant, the most brilliant lawyer in the country, in my opinion. She looked at this guy and she said, you eat hot dogs on the 4th of July, don't you? And what she meant by that was that his ancestors weren't here at the time of the American Revolution either. But they don't have any problem accepting the privileges of American citizenship. But by the same token, when you become an American citizen, you not only accept the privileges, you also accept the responsibilities. And whether you were responsible for fighting in the Revolutionary War or not. And so one of the responsibilities of American citizenship is to enforce our Constitution. It's to uphold civil rights. And if there are civil rights violations, all of us have an obligation to do something to redress them, whether we were responsible for creating them or not, because it was our government acting in our name, whether we were here yet or not, that created these civil rights violations, and we have an obligation to remedy them.
Great response. Makes the world of sense. And the next question is, so ending racism involves both modifying immediate behavior and eliminating structural constructs that enable racism. Can you give us an example of both?
Well, this is a very complicated question. It's certainly, and this is one of the reasons why fixing segregation is also going to be a multi-generational problem, because people adapt to the conditions in which they're forced to live. And they develop habits and orientations that are suitable to the conditions in which they live. For example, I was researching recently a mixed income development, so-called, which had high income units, market rate units in it, and units set aside for low income families, mostly African American. And the two groups didn't get along. And the high-income families complained about the low-income families who would stand on the street and make noise instead of staying in their apartments and socializing there. And they didn't realize, they didn't understand that these were people who have been living in overcrowded conditions in dense, segregated neighborhoods. And when people live in overcrowded conditions, they can't socialize in their homes. They have to socialize in their streets. Now, when you move to middle-class communities, you're expected to socialize in your homes, but you don't abandon those habits overnight. So structural conditions create individual behavior as well as the other way around. And both need to be addressed very, very carefully and sensitively. In my book, The Color of Law, the way these books work is the hardcover version comes out, and then a year later, the paperback version comes out.
Right.
So I had the opportunity in the paperback version to comment on some of the comments I got from people who read the hardcover book. And I got a letter, I talk about this in the paperback version. I got a letter from a young African-American man who had recently graduated from high school. He was from New Orleans. And he said that, when I grew up, I looked around. I saw that all the people around me, the black people were poor. All the people living in the white neighborhoods were rich. Maybe they weren't rich, but he thought they were. They were middle class. And he said, and then I read your book. And I didn't realize that the government had something to do with this. If I had realized that the government had created these problems, I would have worked harder in high school. And I thought it was a very profound comment that he made, because not understanding, people develop stereotypes based on what they see, what they think is possible and how they think it happened. So certainly African-American young people need to work harder in high school, but they're not going to work harder in high school if they don't see that it will yield opportunities that hard work will result in. Now, some do. I mean, obviously, we have very many successful African-Americans today, but on average, many of them, what social psychologists call it a stereotype threat.
Right.
They act out what they think is expected of them.
And another aspect of that is the segregation of the living arrangements impacts the schooling, because if you can't get into a certain neighborhood, it's not your zone. So that plays an effect also, based on, and that you really sparked that and reminded me as we discussed your response just now.
Well, the biggest problem of schooling, though, when it comes to race is not, even though it superficially seems to be the zone that you're in and the school you go to, it's the social and economic conditions that you come to school with. Like I said, when I was a columnist at the New York Times writing about education, week after week, I'd have a column and I'd write about these conditions. I remember writing one about asthma. When African-American children in New York and Chicago and places like that have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. It's an enormous difference. They have asthma because they live in more dense, polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings,
right,
more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't to be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsing the next day. And unless you fix that problem, no matter what zone school you go to, you're not going to achieve the same level as a child who comes to school well rested. And so that's where we need to be focusing our attention primarily, in my view.
Interesting.
Right, because this has led to a policy of psychological damage for generations, health-related damage, which, as we know, will pass from one generation to another quite easily. And I think, something that all of us in real estate encounter on a regular basis, particularly in New York, is gentrification. We play a key role in representing these properties that are experiencing gentrification and the neighborhoods. Yet, gentrification often ends up excluding people and pushing them out. But can you tell us a little bit about the history of how we got here? How does urban renewal translate to modern day gentrification? And how did it provide the framework?
Well, let me say first that I think every neighborhood should be gentrified all over. Every neighborhood should have a mix of housing, market rate housing, perhaps for the affluent, for the middle class, for working class, and for lower income families. That's a healthy neighborhood. That's a democratic society that we need to create. So I don't personally have any objection to neighborhoods that gentrify to some extent. The problem is that we don't control it. So instead of getting healthy gentrification, which improves the resources in low-income segregated neighborhoods and makes them healthier places to live, what happens is eventually all of the existing residents, disproportionately African-American and Hispanic, get pushed out to newly segregated neighborhoods farther away from their jobs even than they were before. And the neighborhood becomes an opposite segregated neighborhood of wealthy people. We know what the policies to prevent massive displacement and gentrification are. It's rent control. It's limits on condominium conversions. It's inclusionary zoning policies that require a set aside not only of units for low-income families, but for moderate-income families. Many gentrifying neighborhoods, it's getting to the point where teachers, nurses, construction workers, firefighters, police can't afford to live in the neighborhoods that they serve. And so we need to have policies that preserve a share of housing for them as well. The problem is not we don't know what policies to follow. The problem is that we don't have the kind of civil rights movement in this country that is going to make it uncomfortable not to implement these policies.
And I think that zoning really, it can enable, as you said, equality. It can also drive inequality. Don Peebles, a prominent developer in the United States who is also Black, recently made a case for bonus FAR, Florida area ratio, to encourage affordable and workforce housing for all. Yet affordable housing often conjures visions of the projects of something undesirable, but they were historically built for white working and middle class families, and they had programs in place to help lift them up. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, you're absolutely right. We all think we know what public housing is. We think it's a place for poor people. That's not how public housing began in this country. The first civilian public housing in this country was created in the New Deal, in the Roosevelt administration, the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration during the Depression. It wasn't for poor people. We had 25% unemployment in this country at the time, but public housing was for the 75% who had good jobs, who could pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. It wasn't subsidized. The government built the public housing and then rented it out at rents that would pay the cost of the housing. And everywhere that the government built this housing, in the New Deal, in the Roosevelt administration, everywhere they did it, they segregated it, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. I mentioned before that both Black and white workers were living in downtown areas in the mid-early 20th century. They lived there because of that's where the jobs were. The Public Works Administration, the very first New Deal agency, went into many of these integrated neighborhoods and built segregated projects, separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed.
Wow.
The great African American, let me just say this, the great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes. Are you familiar with him?
Of course.
Yeah, well, he wrote in his autobiography, it's called The Big C. Go back and look at it. He said he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. It was an integrated high school and an integrated neighborhood.
Right.
But the government went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed.
Amazing. Amazing. So in your opinion, Richard, how can developers build equitable solutions for today? It'd be inspiring to hear success stories such as Montgomery County and Maryland, like if you have anything along those lines.
Well, I hope you didn't invite me here on false pretenses.
No. A lot of the knowledge and eye-opening that you tend to do. So,
I don't have advice for developers. I have advice for you as citizens.
Right.
Because we're all citizens and we all need to be part of a new civil rights movement that's going to force developers to do the right thing.
Right.
They can't do it now. There's no political support for it. You mentioned Montgomery County. It's got a very interesting program, but it's token. It's not. It hasn't desegregated Montgomery County. Montgomery County has, for those of you who don't know, and that Terrence just referred to, it has a program of an inclusionary zoning where any project of more than 25 units has to set aside about 15% of those units for moderate income families. And then of that 15%, the Public Housing Authority of Montgomery County purchases 1/3 of them and uses it for its public housing program. So you get projects that have a mix, as all projects should, of market rate, moderate, and low income families. And what the research shows is that the children of those public housing families who are now living in these units in mixed income projects, those children do far better in school than children who are public housing children, the same demographically identical children who are not living in such projects. But remember, Montgomery County is developed. This doesn't do anything to address the existing segregation in Montgomery County. It only affects new projects of 25 units and more. And so it's an important program, but it's not the total solution.
Right. Interesting.
And Richard, you talk about, as citizens, as humans, we are responsible for future generations and to enable policies of zero segregation and bring people together. What are things we can do as citizens, and just take out real estate from the equation to help drive positive change?
Well, my view is that we need a new civil rights movement in this country, like the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And the civil rights movement in the 1960s didn't spend its time making recommendations to business owners about how they should desegregate. It took to the streets. I'm not suggesting that the same tactics should be used today, but I think every one of us needs to be getting together with like-minded people in our communities and figuring out where good opportunities are for redressing segregation. As, for example, the one I gave before about identifying the banks and the realtors and the developers who created the segregation of the community, and make it uncomfortable to maintain those segregated policies, those segregated patterns. And it can be done. We've seen what mobilized people can do. In the 1960s, we did have a civil rights movement that made it uncomfortable to maintain segregation, and everything from public accommodations to interstate transportation to employment. We don't have that today, but I'll say this. We do have a more accurate and passionate discussion in this country about the legacies of slavery and segregation, Jim Crow, than we ever have had before in American history. And out of that, we had 25 million Americans participate in Black Lives Matter demonstrations that last summer and spring. Most of those were white. Inconceivable just a few years ago. We have white elected politicians running around the South, removing statues that commemorate the defenders of slavery. Inconceivable just a few years ago. So out of that awareness, greater awareness, it's possible to conceive of a new civil rights movement that might take action. I'll give you one very simple thing that anybody can do.
Right.
As you may know, in The Color of Law, I spend some pages reviewing the textbooks that are commonly used in American history courses and all over this country. Every one of them, every one of the most popular American history textbooks lies about this history. They promote the idea of de facto segregation, which, as I said, has no basis in reality. They brag about how the government created these suburbs without ever mentioning that it was for whites only. They promote how wonderful it was that the government created this housing for people in the Depression who were without housing, without ever mentioning that it was on a segregated basis. Well, I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders to create a new national committee to redress racial segregation. And we've created a curriculum, an alternative curriculum on segregation. We've created there's a 17-minute video for high school students I can actually, if you like, I can send you the links to this
ask.
mostly,
If
and
you
you
can
can
provide
see
that, would be
it.
great.
And every one of us, every one of you, every one of us lives in a community with a school board and a principal and a superintendent, and we can look at how this history is being taught and conduct a campaign if necessary to get it taught accurately. So if you'd like, I can send that to you. To whom should I send it? And you can distribute it to attendees in the at this.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And I think that, this is so important. In order to change everything we've learned and how things came to be, we have to understand how we got here, and how de jure is a big proponent, of reason for that. And, we've talked about how this relates to education, how this relates to health, how this relates to policy, how this relates on a more micro scale to the neighborhoods that we live in and the properties that we represent. And what we'd like to do now, Terrence and I will take some audience questions and answers. They've been very patient, but the questions have been pouring in. So we'd love to be able to engage with our audience now. Terrence, take it away.
Okay, perfect. First, we're going to deal with, Daquan Hussein. His question is, can you explain how the Langham construction of temporary wartime housing facilities impacted future public housing policy and promoted segregation in cities like Portland and Cleveland? Because I know we talked a lot about Levittown, but it's pretty much all over.
Absolutely. That's a very sophisticated question. One of the main policies that the federal government used to create segregation in this country was the segregation of migrant workers, black and white, who came to centers of war production during World War II to take jobs in war industries. These hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production, and they overwhelmed the communities in which these war plants were located. So under the Langham Act that your questioner mentioned, the federal government built housing. It wasn't the public housing program, but it was the same thing. It built housing for war workers. And everywhere it built it, it created segregated housing, separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. I now live on the West Coast, near where I live, in Richmond, California. There were shipyards. Enormous shipyards built by the Kaiser Company, 5 shipyards. Hundreds of thousands of workers came to those shipyards to take jobs there during the war. Migrants from the South primarily, but also from the Midwest. The government built housing for those workers. For the white workers, it built housing along the residential areas of 2 communities south of Richmond, Albany and Berkeley, California. For the black workers, it built housing along the railroad tracks in the industrial area, segregated housing. These were workers working in the same shipyards, in the same factories. There was a Ford factory that had been converted to production of Jeeps and tanks, working together. In my book, I have a picture of black and white workers at that Ford plant during World War II, working together side by side, but they had to live separately in separate projects. Well, the Langham Act expired at the end of World War II, and Congress required the government to disband, to get rid of its housing projects for war workers at the end of the war. In most parts of the country, the local housing authorities took over those war projects and made them part of their public housing projects. But in so-called liberal Berkeley, the city refused to take it over. It said it was not a suitable place for housing. And the projects were demolished. The white workers in the good units of the housing that were near the residential areas were easily able to find housing elsewhere. The African American workers who were living in the units along the industrial area couldn't find housing. So the city of Berkeley hired a social worker to place them in public housing in Oakland. The housing was demolished, as I said, because Berkeley and the University of California, which also owned the land, some of the land, said this was unsuitable area for housing. The projects were demolished, and a few years later, the University of California built housing there for graduate students and faculty members. So this is an example of what happened with war housing, and the same thing happened throughout the country.
Interesting.
So taking it from housing to education, our audience member Jessica Mays asks, how can we drive policies that will allow for integration of our schools and fund our children's education, not based on high producing or low producing taxes obtained from owning a home? How do we drive more equality in education?
You know, this is not, I don't have a practical answer for this because there is no practical answer. In the long term, we can't have high quality schools if they're segregated, and we can't have desegregated schools if the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. New York is, let me say, is a little bit unusual. A little bit, not a little bit, it's a lot unusual. It's possible for children to access relatively easily, because of the transportation system and the compact nature of the city, to access schools in different neighborhoods. But in most parts of the country, almost everywhere in the country, it's not possible for children to access schools outside their own neighborhoods without enormously long bus or car rides that take them far from home. We're not going to be able to solve this problem unless we desegregate the neighborhoods so that we can have integrated schools in integrated neighborhoods. Property taxes that support schools, it's certainly a big problem, but New York City spends more money per pupil than almost any other district in the country. And it still has the kinds of inequalities in education that I talked about, not because it doesn't spend enough money. It could certainly spend more and should spend more, but it's because of the problems that I described before, like the asthma and lead poisoning and homelessness and economic insecurity that children come to school with, that makes it, that creates challenges for them to learn. So fundamentally, we need to change the social and economic conditions that children come to school with.
Definitely. So we're getting a couple of questions pertaining to specific laws. So Leonard Steinberg asks, what specific laws do you believe should be changed now? Like, is there anything that is like blatantly there that we need to work on challenging?
Sure. But let me say again, and I'm going to risk repeating myself, I can give you all kinds of things that should be changed, but if there's no civil rights movement to create the pressure to change them, it's not going to happen. One of the things that should be changed is exclusionary zoning. Communities that have zoning rules that permit nothing but single-family homes on large lot sizes to be built, that effectively exclude people who could have afforded to live in those communities when they were created, but were unconstitutionally excluded from them. And now they're excluded not by racial deed clauses, they're excluded by zoning rules that don't permit the construction of townhouses or condominiums or garden apartments or anything, or ADUs that are of decent size.
Right.
So that's one law that has to be changed. Changing it will not make miracles, but it's a first step. We need to change the way in which we place LIHTC developments. This is not something that you're involved in particularly, but the low-income housing tax credit that reinforces segregation today, because a disproportionate share of low-income housing tax credit units are placed in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. That needs to be changed. So those are two examples. We should, of course, the biggest thing we need to change is we need to remedy the exclusion of working and middle-class African Americans from suburban communities that were once affordable to them and that are no longer affordable. And for that, we need large subsidies, because those, as I say, those places are no longer affordable, but they would have been had African Americans permitted to live them. So we need large subsidies for them. We need an affirmative action program in housing that's going to subsidize African Americans in particular to move to places where they were, from which they were historically excluded.
This is such a great answer that segues right into our next question. Sue Miao asks, From the little I know, government subsidized housing is often abused by slumlords and unscrupulous tenants, and it traps aspirational tenants who seek a better future, but they risk losing housing if they seek even a minimum wage job. Is there a better solution, in your opinion, to the affordable housing crisis?
Yes, there is. Well, I don't know. I don't want to get into political territory here. But
You may.
Yeah, I'm going to say the same thing. Speak your mind, please.
Well, let me give you an analogy. Some of you may disagree with this, but I'll give it anyway. We have the most inefficient healthcare system in the world. Our outcomes are worse than other industrialized countries. Our costs are higher because we've privatized the whole thing. We do not have a government sponsored healthcare system. It's subcontracted to private insurance companies. By the same token, we subcontract our affordable housing to private developers. What we should have, and I firmly believe this, is we should have public housing of the kind, Meghna, that you referred to before, like we originally had when we first created public housing, not on a segregated basis, but for working and middle-class families, as well as for low-income families. Public housing should be mixed income. It should not be just for the poor. And in fact, one of the reasons that public housing came to deteriorate and become known as urban slums is because we had a policy of evicting people from public housing if they got better jobs. And that was absurd. What we did was we deliberately created urban slums by ensuring that the only people who could live in public housing were the poorest families, and we concentrated all those disadvantages in one place and they reinforced each other instead of mixed income public housing. So I would like to see us go back to the original conception of public housing that has units that are subsidized for some low-income families, but also have more modest subsidies depending on the community for working and middle-class families, workforce housing, and it has market rate housing. Public housing was the most desirable housing available when it was first created. There were long waiting lists of working families who wanted to get into it. We should return to that conception and never again make the mistake of evicting families who could contribute the most to public housing in order to concentrate the poor in a single place.
Interesting. I have a quick comment before we jump into the next question. Something that I'm seeing from speaking to numerous individuals is a lot of things have been brought to the forefront with a lot of what's happened with George Floyd in this year. So what I'm seeing and understanding more is that people are seeing there's a lot of crime in certain neighborhoods that were segregated. But what they're not fully understanding is that's the residual effects of what the government put in place many years ago. So now they're seeing those issues bubble up for decades upon decades. So it's interesting. And like I said, also your book really enlightened me to that. So it's just good for people to have a little clarity on that. Not that anything is justified or any wrongdoing is justified, but people were put into a situation where they didn't have a lot of opportunities, so they tried to make way, however their environment made them do it. Like I said, not that anything is justified, but it was just interesting. And like I said, I thank you for bringing all of this to a forefront. But the next question is from Hakeem Green. He asks, what would be the most effective way to close the wealth gap between Black and white America, and should reparations be part of that equation? I know that's been loosely discussed in some states, and I know some states they're actually talking about cannabis laws, and it's like a bunch of different things.
Well, I don't use the term reparations very much, excuse me, because I think most people misunderstand it. When most people use the term reparations, they think of a single monetary payment. It would inevitably be token to the present generation. And not only would that not fix things, but people would then use the excuse of saying, okay, we've taken care of that problem. Now it's African Americans' responsibility to pull themselves up. Reparations, there are many policies we should follow that would be costly. I'm not opposed to spending a lot of money. We should. Perhaps more money than the typical reparations programs they're talking about. For example, to use the example that I referred to earlier, the federal government should be subsidizing the purchase of homes of working middle-class African Americans in communities from which they were historically excluded when they were affordable and which are now unaffordable. That would be a very expensive program. As I said, I call that an affirmative action program in housing. You know, Levittown, that we started by talking about, is now 1% African American because we have a Fair Housing Act, and
Wow.
Americans who can buy a $500,000 home can do so. But Levittown, as you know better than I do, is in a neighborhood that's about 15% African American. So the federal government should be buying up 14% of the homes in Levittown and reselling them at deeply discounted prices to working and middle-class African Americans. That would be a very expensive program because it wouldn't be just Levittown. I'm talking about suburbs all over the country. Well, so I'm not opposed to spending a lot of money. In fact, I'm very much in favor of spending a lot of money to solve this problem. But there are many, many things we can do that don't cost anything at all. I mentioned a couple of them before, prohibiting zoning ordinances that prevent anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes from being built in a residential community. Redesigning the way the low-income housing tax credit program is used so that we don't disproportionately use it to reinforce segregation by placing almost all of our low-income units in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. So we need a mix of policies, some of which would cost money, some of which would be cost-free, but be very radical, perhaps, policies that are necessary to redress segregation. And the discussion of reparations tends to take attention away from the policies that we need to follow. Now, if you're talking about reparations in the proper sense of the term, everything that needs to be done to repair the harm we've done, then I'm all in favor of it. But if we're talking about a single monetary payment to the current generation, this is going to take more than one generation to solve.
Exactly.
And monetary payment would never be great enough to solve it, even for the present generation.
Great
I
answer.
agree. And, you know, I think what's so important is it's impossible to talk policy without invoking some sort of politics. And, you know, the two do go hand in hand sometimes. So Brian Tormey asks us, assuming a Democratic majority in the Senate, what single federal policy should be at the top of the list to address and help adjust the course of the issues in discussion tonight? You know, if we had to choose, what should be the first thing?
Well, I'm glad he's expecting a Democratic majority in the Senate.
Let's just, yeah.
My focus really, I'm serious about this, very serious. My focus is not on federal policy at this point, because without a new civil rights movement, we can dream all we want about new policies. It's not going to impact anything. Can I take a couple of minutes to give you an example?
Definitely,
please.
Let me give you this example. In 1970, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development was a fellow named George Romney. Maybe that name sounds familiar to you. He was the father of the present senator, former presidential candidate. You know, the subtitle of my book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, because this history was well known to people in the 20th century. George Romney said the federal government has created a white noose around every black neighborhood in the country, and it's the federal government's obligation. This was Republican Secretary of Housing and Urban Development said it's the federal government's obligation to untie that noose. And he proposed a program called Open Communities, in which the federal government was going to withhold community development block grants from any suburb that refused to desegregate. They refused to change its zoning rules. They refused to accept subsidized housing. They refused to accept public housing at the time. He actually withheld funds. 1970 withheld funds from 3 suburbs Baltimore County, not the city, but the county that surrounds Baltimore, Warren, Michigan, and a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, withheld funds because they refused to take steps to desegregate. Well, President Nixon canceled the program, forced Romney out as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and we've had nothing so radical since. Well, I could tell you that the first thing I'd like a Democratic president to do, or Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, is to say he's going to withhold funds from suburbs that refuse to take action to desegregate. But you know why Romney was unable to implement that program? He was unable to implement that program because suburbanites do not support that program at this point. The Democratic Party, if we can get into politics again, the Democratic Party is a coalition of many minority and low-income families, blacks and Hispanics, and suburbanites who are liberal on social issues if it's not in their own community. We call them NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And no Democratic president is going to be successful in implementing the kind of program that Romney did, so long as it's dependent on the current views of white suburban residents. So we need a new civil rights movement that's going to change the political calculus of those policies. So I could tell you that, yes, I'd like to see an open communities program implemented by the next president. But it's completely unrealistic at this point. We need a new civil rights movement. That's our highest priority. And let me say this, if I can say one more thing. You know, I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders to create something we call a National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation. And its focus is going to be to support local committees of the kind I'm talking about, to create campaigns